but let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this nutshell conversation. As a reminder, this is part of a series of virtual conversations put on as a collaboration between the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry and the Savannah Institute. We're coming together in this space to share dialogue and make connections between science and practice. During each conversation, panelists representing both the science and practice spaces will meet, share a little about their work, exchange questions, and engage in a dialogue with you. And so please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat box. You can say where you're from and any affiliations you'd like to share so we know who's with us. My name is Hannah Himmelgarn. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator at the Center for Agroforestry at MU. And Katie Adams is also here as behind the scenes co-host tonight. Katie is the Illinois Demonstration Farm Manager at the Savannah Institute, and she'll be helping coordinate audience questions and providing any technical assistance needed along the way. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize the ancestral stewards of these lands. Because we're all from unique geographic locations, we invite you to open the native land map. We'll link in the chat. You can enter your location there and take a moment to acknowledge the community is deeply connected to the unceded land where you live. Know that this map is not perfect. It is eternally incomplete and may leave out or misrepresent the fullness of Indigenous peoples and their histories here. Though many of these Native nations were forcefully removed from their traditional territory, these lands continue to carry the stories of these diverse peoples and their struggles for survival and identity. As agroforesters, we feel we have an obligation and a responsibility to recognize, elevate, and support Indigenous peoples, and to publicly acknowledge their foundational contributions to the life of the spaces where we work and live. With that, tonight, our nutshell conversations will include Matt Lebon and Sarah Lovell. Dr. Sarah Lovell serves as the H.E. Garrett Endowed Chair Professor and the Director for the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. This appointment follows 10 years as faculty at the University of Illinois and 3 years on the faculty at University of Vermont. Her research philosophy has evolved from an interdisciplinary background, including an MS and a PhD in agronomy, followed by a master's in landscape architecture from the University of Illinois. Dr. Lovell's research program has emphasized whole farm planning, productive agroforestry, and urban agriculture as part of multifunctional landscapes. She's published 60 peer-reviewed journal articles and been awarded over $10 million in competitive grants. Through this body of work, Dr. Lovell is committed to improving the resiliency of our food system through perennial cropping systems that supply nutrient-dense and healthy products. Matt Lebon is most passionate about creating magical food moments. He's driven by the belief that food connects us all. By cultivating food crops with a reverence for Mother Earth, he believes we can begin to heal our bodies and the land. Matt got his start with farming as a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, where he was initially bit by the gardening bug. He went on to study ecological design and work on several farms in Israel and Brooklyn, New York. For 5 seasons, Matt worked at the Earth Dance Organic Farm School in Ferguson, Missouri, until he left that role of farm manager in 2017. Now, with Custom Food Scaping, Matt is a practitioner and designer of edible landscapes and gardens. Sarah and Matt will each share about their work in the first half hour, and then they'll each exchange questions to start the conversation. You're welcome to post questions for either or both of them in the chat at any time, and we'll come back around to those in the second half of the hour. Okay, with that, Sarah, are you ready to begin? You can share your screen.
I think I am. Just a second here. All right. Can you all see this?
Looks good.
All right. I see a shaking head. Okay, good. And let me know if the slides don't advance. That occasionally happens too. So Hannah just asked that we do kind of a brief introduction to our research and just kind of what we're doing related to this topic of urban food systems. So most of my research kind of fits under this broad frame of landscape multifunctionality. And I see this as an opportunity to really look at agroecosystems and think about how we design them in a sustainable way. And the idea of multifunctionality to me is easier to conceptualize than the concept of sustainability, because there are kind of some specific things that we can look at. So I define this as landscapes that integrate ecological, cultural, and production functions, and really emphasizing that we want to consider the site-specific context, which would be, in our case, looking at an urban area, which is very much different than doing the same types of practices in a rural area. And also thinking about the needs and preferences of the user. Also extremely important in this urban context, because there are so many different stakeholders and users of these urban spaces. So we think about how we stack these different functions. We can stack the ecological, cultural, and production functions with a goal to obtain a higher level of landscape performance overall. Okay, so urban agriculture itself has been really proposed as a sustainable and multifunctional type of landscape solution. And so you can think about the agricultural part very much, even by definition, meets those production functions. You're producing food and maybe cut flowers or other items. And oftentimes these spaces also provide the ecological functions like infiltration of stormwater, sequestering carbon, cycling nutrients, providing habitat for wildlife, conservation of biodiversity, those types of things. And then also those cultural functions are really interesting in an urban environment, because you can bring in things like artistic expression, you can bring in cultural values, you can bring in research. I consider that a cultural function, research and education. So we've looked at urban agriculture as one of these great multifunctional solutions. And that was one of the research lines that I've been working on for around 10 or 12 years. And when I was fairly recently at the University of Illinois, we focused on Chicago. And we're looking at a map on the right here of Chicago, and asking the question, like, what is the extent of urban agriculture in a city like Chicago? And there were there's a lot of information going around about the idea of food deserts, and how Chicago had like 600 community gardens that could help contribute to reducing food insecurity. And so that was cool to think about, like 600 community gardens, that's a lot. And so we started doing some research on some of those community gardens. And what we found was that we'd show up to a site that was labeled and mapped as a community garden, and there would be either no food production in that garden, or sometimes not a garden at all. So, you know, like half or more of the time, it seemed like it wasn't at least going by our definition of a community garden as being a food producing garden. So that began kind of this task of thinking about how we map out these spaces, and then realizing that we could scan all the aerial imagery for the city and kind of find a signature of food production in the city, at least for kind of conventional production of vegetables and things in rows. We realized that we could actually identify backyard gardens at the residential scale. So we mapped out all of these spaces and found that the number of community gardens was much less than what had been proposed, at about 135 instead of around 600. There were a number of larger community farms or urban farms. There were school gardens, about 50 of those throughout the city. There were some vacant lot gardens where they basically covered a whole vacant lot space, which in Chicago is a space of about, a lot of the lots are actually conventionally about 25 feet wide and 125 feet deep. And then the residential gardens were by far the highest in number, but also the greatest in total amount of size and area that was producing food in the city. And relatively unstudied were these kind of backyard garden spaces. Now, I'll also say that we validated this approach and went and visited a lot of those sites, the sampling of the sites and all of the community garden sites we visited. And so an accurate approach, but if anything, it's very much underestimating food production, because it can't really account for the types of systems we're talking about, like permaculture, multi-scale approaches that aren't following a signature garden space. So if anything, kind of underrepresenting. So there was a lot of research done in this area. We did a lot of work on some specific communities, 3 different communities in Chicago, looking at different cultural and ecological services, doing a lot of soil sampling and sampling plants. And we asked this question about, what ecosystem services, which are the good things, or disservices, which are the more negative things, are supported specifically by these backyard gardens. And on the positive end, we found that backyard gardens contributed to local food systems. They were providing food, and more specifically, culturally appropriate food. So we worked in a couple of communities that one was mostly a Mexican origin community, and another was mostly Chinese origin community. And a lot of them were producing foods from their homelands and creating foods that they weren't able to find in local grocery stores. On the negative side, we often found that these backyard gardens relied very heavily on external inputs. That despite the fact that we wanted them, we wished that they would be doing all this composting and kind of nutrient cycling within their own spaces. What the findings were that they actually, in some cases, were over applying things like herbicides, over applying fertilizers, too much potassium in the soil, etc. So that was one issue. And we also found by sampling those gardens that there were some issues with soil contamination that could potentially threaten food safety. And so that soil contamination, what we were testing for was lead, and that was found in a number of spaces. And there are probably other contaminants as well. So, and then kind of the big one I wanted to highlight here was and it's kind of a plus minus, is that these backyard garden spaces hosted a really high level of biodiversity, a lot of different plant species, but that they mostly lack trees and shrubs that could provide different levels of structural diversity. And then as we start thinking about this, it kind of leads us down this path of questioning, does urban agriculture end up kind of at odds with some of the urban tree canopy efforts? There's a lot of interest in urban tree planting, understanding that there are some huge benefits of having trees in an urban environment, like getting microclimate control, which helps mitigate that urban heat island, getting habitat and food resources for urban wildlife. Because we have that woody biomass, we have more carbon sequestration. And most studies have found that people actually prefer the visual quality of settings that include trees in them. So you're missing out on a lot of these opportunities. So then it brings up the question, is agroforestry, where we're combining trees and shrubs with crops or livestock, is that an appropriate option in an urban setting and as an opportunity to produce food in urban settings? So, integrating trees, crops, and livestock for healthy and profitable farms and vibrant communities is how we're thinking about this. And this has really kind of evolved into thinking about maybe a 6th practice of agroforestry. Mostly we've looked in the past at alley cropping, forest farming, riparian buffers, silvopasture, and windbreaks. But then this 6th practice would be urban food forests, where we're intentionally using perennial food crops and improving the sustainability, multifunctionality, and resilience of urban communities. So now the research, now that we've kind of gone in this direction of looking more in urban spaces with agroforestry, some questions start to arise. And so one of these questions that continually was coming up was, is it safer to produce these woody species like fruits and nuts on woody plants in soils that are contaminated versus producing vegetables in those spaces? For example, we know that lead, it's a heavy metal, it's very immobile, so it mostly stays in the soil. So you might think that what we know about vegetables is that most of the lead issues with vegetables grown in urban soils is the soil itself sticking to the plants and actually the tilling of the soil, so breathing in the lead from tilling the soil. So a lot of interest in this possibility that maybe that lead can't be transferred to the edible portions of the plants. And so what we found was that there's not a lot of research that's been done on this, particularly in the US, and very few articles written in English. But it turns out there have been a lot of articles written in Russian. And we had a graduate student from Kazakhstan who could read all of those Russian journal articles and was able to distill a good number of studies that give us some insight into this. And, you know, just some overall findings is that we know that food grown in urban environments, it does have some potential risk of accumulating heavy metals and polyaromatic hydrocarbons. But the contamination is generally less with woody crops than it is with vegetables, although you can always find studies that contradict these trends. So we'd hesitate to make any recommendations based on this, other than that we need a lot more research on this topic. Another thing we're interested in is finding out how these urban food forest spaces and sites might be designed more with people and communities in mind, not just thinking about the plant part, but thinking about how important those stakeholders and users are. So here, thinking about engaging the communities, developing those partnerships, how we help people link to some of the existing expertise, whether it's in extension or other areas, thinking about how we design the spaces to be really useful in terms of connecting with people. So providing gathering areas, making sure we're thinking about the food security aspect and considering cultural preferences, selecting appropriate plants, integrating systems. So not just thinking about the plant systems, but thinking about like waste streams that are in nearby areas. And can you take some of those waste materials and recycle those into either nutrients or some other aspect? And then encouraging things like artistic expression in these spaces, the reasons people like to be in green spaces in urban areas anyway. So those are some of the questions. One fun example we've gotten to work on just in the past year is working with some partners we have at the Osage Nation in Oklahoma. And they had an opportunity to expand their community farm that they have in Pawhuska and expand it to include a community orchard. And they received some funding to be able to do that. This is a map that just shows the town of Pawhuska, and you can see in the lower right-hand side is where the existing farm was located and where they were going to extend to include this orchard. You can also see the proximity to the high school, elementary school, and their historic preservation office. And here, kind of drilling into where the farm site was, the primary orchard area was going to be that green area, and the orange area is a potential area to even expand the orchard further. And then the farm itself was moving into that zone where the pink box was, and they're building greenhouses and other infrastructure for that. And we worked a lot with them to understand their preferences for plant species. We thought a lot about things like the types of native plants that they would have used on their ancestral lands and trying to reconnect with those. And there were also some species that they just requested for preferences for their communities, like apples and peaches. And so thinking about the different varieties for those. And then how we start to lay out these different spaces for them in kind of a practical way. And we provided a lot of like site analysis material to help decide and determine where the best spots would be. And then coming up with a plan that included a lot of opportunities for a range of different species, mostly native species, a wide variety of nut trees, native nut trees, persimmons, pawpaws, elderberries, etc. And then also the apple trees would be in there too with 3 different cultivars. So that's just kind of an example of one of the projects that brings in a really important community and cultural element. So I'll leave it at that. And I will stop sharing and pass it over to Matt.
All right. Let me see if I can get this screen up so I can try to. Can you all see in here?
Looks great.
Okay, Hannah, should I go ahead and launch into my presentation, or should I ask some questions first?
Let's
Sarah?
save the questions. Let's build on our question list, and then we can bring those into the conversation once you're finished with your presentation.
Okay. Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Matt, and I am going to talk to you all a little bit about some of the some of the application that it was really cool to hear Sarah talk about, which is like, what do a lot of people who hear presentations like Sarah's do with that information in the urban and suburban context if they want to bring a project to fruition, but they may not necessarily have the skills to design and install some kind of food forest inspired landscape. And so we really kind of like pick up the ball after that a lot of times with our company, which is based in St. Louis, Missouri, by the way, and help people kind of achieve that in their backyards or at their schools, all kinds of different places. And I will be talking to you all about that in this little presentation here. For whatever reason, I'm having trouble advancing my slide. All right, so this is a lot of kind of what we do. This is like 4 of the major things we do. We do food forests. Obviously, that's kind of why I'm here, but we also do other things like school orchards. We work with restaurants. We do a lot of like kitchen gardens. So we kind of have a whole a range of different services. But really, like, our whole goal is kind of trying to bring this food forest idea to the public. And I think that my own personal story is that I, heard about permaculture and was like so smitten with this idea of a food forest and this place that was beautiful and bountiful and kind of forageable. And that really took me down the whole path of learning about farming and gardening, because unfortunately, I realized, if we want to be if we want the food forest, we really have to learn the geeky stuff, like all the plants and soil and go down that whole path. So this is kind of what we do. I think it's summed up pretty well in these 2 pictures. We do a lot of what you see on the left, trying to create this idea of, vegetable garden meets agroforestry in your backyard in a way that looks aesthetically pleasing and won't throw up too many red flags with the neighbors or the HOA or whomever. So a lot of times that looks like, just things like some fruit trees and an asparagus patch and, an edible hedge of bushes. And then the picture on the right is, my yard, my front yard there. And that's kind of just the aesthetic of a lot of, I think, what oftentimes we are designing for when we're kind of trying to create one of these multi-layered landscapes, like Sarah talked about, multi-layered, multifunctional, all different types of plants, from roots and the fungal layer all the way up to the fruit tree canopy or the nut tree canopy. So in terms of breaking this down, a lot of times I think when I'm teaching this, I often kind of bring it back to the indigenous knowledge of the Three Sisters Garden, which I think so many people are familiar with if they've, started down the garden rabbit hole at all. And for those of you who are not in the United States, this is a really common companion planting scheme that was used all over the Americas, using corn, beans, and squash to create this multi-layered landscape. And each plant is filling its own niche. With our work, we're basically taking that, we're trying to perennialize it. And we're trying to, you can see that thought bubble in the top right. It's kind of asking like, well, the life cycle of these plants is a perennial one, as opposed to the Three Sisters Garden that we saw in the previous slide. And so I think that this awesome slide really helps us depict what it is and break down the different components of the landscape that we are designing for. And I'm sure that many of us are familiar with these images, but we've got these centerpiece trees that produce a lot of calories. And we know that if we want to have, biodiversity, if we want to, I'm looking at my notes because, I love what Sarah said about ecosystem services, right? We know that agroforestry and food forestry is striving for something way beyond monocultured systems, even if they are, fruit or nut producing trees or other perennials. We've got to do better. We've got to bring in all the pollinators. We've got to create biomass. We've got to keep the ground covered. We've got all these different goals that, of course, are ultimately just serving our larger goal of trying to figure out how we can sustain our species on this planet without destroying it. So, breaking this down a little bit further to how it actually applies to my work, we are really looking at trying to mimic, in many cases, a lot of the traditional landscaping strategies that we see around town, whether that be in the suburban and urban landscape. But how do we create these? How do we design these and implement them so that these are forageable landscapes? Because, like I said in that slide, a little bit ago, that's really, for me, what I think so many people are interested in. It's certainly what is really dreamy for me myself, is the idea of not necessarily having to tend your garden like you would, your rows of arugula, but what is it like to, spend a few days a year doing, a good amount of work to maintain your perennial landscape, and in the meantime, mostly getting to enjoy a lot of that landscape. So, so a lot of this is all about plants for me, and unique plants that are well adapted for making this whole idea of edible landscaping or food foresting possible. And for the most part, I'm going to fly through a bunch of these slides here, but it's really, I break it down into two different groupings, and these are natives. Like we saw some awesome pictures from Sarah of some pawpaws, which are a really neat native that I'm going to get to in a second, as well as what I would consider well-suited exotics. And these exotic plants are food-producing plants like apples that are not from our part of the world. And we focus on the ones that are mostly not subject to too much pest and disease problems, because that's the real issue with so many of the home gardeners, is that they get plagued with pest and disease, and then they don't know what to do, and management and maintenance is a nightmare. And we really need to focus on the easy to grow fruits. I think one of the first fruits I ever harvested and enjoyed was the mulberry. And for those of you in the United States, it's all over the world, but I don't know how easy it is to grow in other places. But here, like the mulberry, it just rains delicious fruit down. You don't seem to have to do very much. And that has kind of driven my interest. How do we create that kind of abundance where things just want to grow and produce, and we can share the fruit with the birds and enjoy ourselves? So let's look at some of those plants. I think the pawpaw is an absolutely, it's a stunner, 5-star native that produces incredible fruit like a mango and a banana, and it's a beautiful tree. It is quite slow growing, so it struggles a little bit with our edible landscaping component, but if we do the proper education with clients, I think it tends to generally be a winner. And one of the big things to know is that with a lot of these natives, like the pawpaw, for us at least, we are planting exclusively grafted varieties for the most part. And that's because we are really trying to ensure that we've got the most desirable characteristics for those trees and shrubs, and because our goal is food production. So that would be a native. A jujube would be an exotic, and these have been grown in the United States for quite some time now. A lot of really beautiful trees have done really well in our Midwestern climate here, zone 6B. and easy to grow, loaded with fruit, almost no pest and disease. And so these are some of the plant, you know, this one is an interesting specialty crop in your agroforestry systems, very medicinal, tons of information from China about this one. So check out Jujube. And we love the persimmon. Persimmon might be my favorite fruit, and it's another native for us. And we've been really trying to figure out how to be able to plant more persimmons, because they're such incredible fruit, but they're actually pretty ugly trees most of the time, with ratty leaves. So we've been planting a lot of hybrid persimmons that are crossed between the Asian and the American, and those are mostly from Russia. And so that's kind of an interesting area for us, where we can get a lot of the cold hardiness of the American with some of the ornamental aspects of the Asian persimmons. Staying in Asia, we love the Asian pear. Asian pear has been one of our fastest, most easy to grow varieties. And as long as you stay away from the fire blight susceptible varieties, it's a really bountiful tree. I tell most people, if they're interested in pears or apples, this is probably a better place to start, because the Asian pears in our climate bear earlier, grow faster, and have fewer pest and disease issues. If you are going to grow the peaches and the apples and pears, just be sure to look for the disease resistance. You know, there's a lot of things that want to eat these trees in our climate. And so we tell people, you know, let's start with the most resilient genetics we can get, and then go from there, so that we don't need to rely on sprays. And how can we create markets where, you know, perfect looking fruit doesn't have to be delivered? So that's a whole nother conversation that I'm certainly not living that. Talked about the mulberry. I absolutely love it. It's a huge winner for us. There's even a really great shrub, the Girardi dwarf mulberry, which is a really great edible landscaping one. Maybe our most commonly planted tree, I think this one is a really interesting specialty crop for agroforesters, is the serviceberry or the Juneberry. There's tons of different Amelanchier species all over North America, and many of them are, I think, could potentially be very well suited to agroforestry settings in the way that blueberries and currants might be. We're looking for some of the smaller varieties, trying to figure out how we can grow them so they're not quite so tall, so they're easier to pick. Same, the elderberries, you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. They're maybe with the mulberry, the easiest fruit growing plant we can put in the ground. So fast and productive. Another native, and here's another native we love, the native clove currant, Ribes odoratum. This is a beautiful shrub that, you know, some of these ribes, like the currant family, they can handle some shade, which is a really important thing for our landscapes that we're designing for, because there's a lot of shade oftentimes. Bush cherries we found to be great. A lot of people are kind of scratching their head usually when we tell them about bush cherries, but there's several different species of bush cherry that don't really succumb to the diseases that the sweet cherry trees succumb to. And the same thing really with the pie cherries, that Prunus cerasus. In the United States, we've got much less disease pressure, it appears, than the sweet cherry. So planting these bush cherries are kind of a range of sweet to semi-sweet and tart, but we'd highly encourage folks to check those out. And we've got a bunch of awesome grapes, and I don't know, I would be super curious to hear from Sarah even about grapes, and especially some of our lesser known native grape varieties. I think there's a great opportunity, and almost every house we work with has an opportunity to plant some kind of arbor or trellis. But a lot of the next, you know, to round out my presentation, we're going to look at some of the next layers, you know, some of the ones that the trees and the shrubs are a lot of the centerpieces that we're looking at, but what about all the plants around them? What are those? And so I think this is where it gets really fun, and this is where we can really enjoy a forageable landscape. With these are different natives that are all produce an edible crop. Things like golden glow, which is Rudbeckia species, and the native prickly pear, There's even a woodland aster species, big leaf aster, that we're planting a bunch these days. So these are all plants that they're not necessarily, 5-star deliciousness, easy to, they're not your lettuce, but these are incredibly interesting, have a wonderful history, and potentially could be, unique specialty crops if you're growing for market. Same thing with a lot of these, not the hostas and the udo are not native, but we've got other native crops that like Solomon seal and ostrich fern that make delicious spring shoots. And we're simply just planting these in the places where, they look beautiful and offer this opportunity. Harvest them, don't harvest them, they're going to fill in their niche. And then you got exotics like hosta and udo. Udo is Aurelia cordata, which is also known as like mountain asparagus, I believe, in Korea. So a really interesting, there's just all kinds of opportunities for filling in all those niches around our fruit trees and shrubs. And then kind of throwing in all the fun ones, most people don't know things. Every part of the daylily is edible. All these long, tall sedums have edible leaves, and the violets are edible. They're a native perennial. So we kind of fill in the understory with all these good fun ones. And while we're mulching all around it, let's make sure we grow all kinds of mushrooms like wine caps and oyster mushrooms. A lot of clients have gotten really excited about the idea of getting in the fungal friends. And then, to round, as we kind of head into the home stretch here, I'll show you some of our projects that we've worked on. This is kind of a backyard edible woodland. So you can see, this is just, pretty much every plant we put in this yard is edible. And we've got Solomon seal and an ostrich fern and aronia berry and tart cherry trees, some salvaged garden blocks to make some veggie beds. This is my backyard, and so this is kind of what our food forest looked like last year after 5 years. And so this is this I think it just personally helps, I've found, to just offer this as something to understand what a backyard food forest could even look like. What is it? What are we going for here? At least this is what we were going for. And a lot of different plants that we just talked about are in here. And this is that forageable experience that I mentioned here. But it's only, these are other pictures from our yard. This is only a 5,000 square foot yard, our entire yard. So we've gone, kind of to the max in getting rid of our grass and creating opportunities for growing food. But, and it's all not, of course it's not food entirely. It's medicine, and it's native flowers, and it's that whole scale of ecosystem services. We worked on some school orchards and creating these kind of like linear food forests, we call them, where we're like using the whole swale and berm method to kind of move water gently across the landscape. And this is one project we did with a school several years ago. And, this is some of the inspiration that for where I learned about some of this stuff and some of the nurseries that you can get some of these plants. But with that said, I would love to hop into question time and hear what y'all are thinking, and we can chat back and forth here.
Great. We have quite a few questions that have been coming in the chat, so you can check those out. But let's start with the questions that you all have for each other. So Matt, I know you said you had some burning questions for Sarah. So if you want to start us off.
You bet. I mean, Sarah's work is incredible. I'm so fascinated. Gosh, I have too many for this time, but I would love to. One of the huge leverage points that I would love for you to talk on, Sarah, is this idea of the community orchard instead of the community garden, because one of the things that we tell everybody who says, oh, Custom Food Scaping, you help us with a community garden. You know, there's obviously, there's so many defunct community gardens around the world, and there's so much organization and sustenance required. So what is your spiel around, or do you have a spiel around community orcharding? And love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, I don't know if I have a spiel. Certainly, I have a long list of the extra ecosystem services that I feel like they provide. So, you know, the more carbon sequestration, the microclimate control thing, I think plays really well. But also, I think there's a really good case to be made for the fact that if designed right, and if the plants are chosen carefully and thoughtfully, that the maintenance overall is going to be much less over time. It's obviously more upfront cost and time to get established and everything. But once it's well established, they, you know, a lot of them can mostly take care of themselves. So there's less of that labor input, and especially like not needing to be there like every day or every other day for watering and things like that. So that's a big part of it. Also, just kind of to diversify the products that you're producing. So I wouldn't say that, you know, a community garden should be entirely replaced with a community orchard, but to have both options, I think, is really great for nutrient diversity and just having a diversity of different products. Maybe the tricky part is that people are, especially in the US, I think people are used to having a space that they own or that they have, you know, that's kind of theirs, even if they don't own it. Like if they have an allotment type of garden and a community garden, then that's theirs to care for. The community orchard, on the other hand, typically it's not like I own this tree, you have that tree or whatever. It's more like it really is a more communal space. And that's something that maybe we're not as used to managing and caring for appropriately, and only taking, you know, our own fair share.
Yeah, I love that. We got to figure out a way to kind of get out of our own way and figure out that whole sharing and communal piece.
Yeah. And then the beauty is, so certainly the beauty, I think, of community orchards or any sort of food forest space is just so incredible, because it's there year round too. And so I really do love the combination of both, because I like to see kind of if there are some raised beds maybe for accessibility, and then some other vegetable spaces, but then having a lot of variety in the types of plant materials and having that kind of multi-layered structure, I think, is really incredibly beautiful. And you end up with some amazing spring flowering. You know, you're talking about June berries, and like, what's more amazing than having that spring flowering from June berries and then having berries so early in the spring? It's so nice. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a if you had to point at any one like project that most inspires you in this urban context that could kind of be somewhat of a roadmap for us, does anything come to mind?
You know, I see a lot of cool designs of things. So like the I guess Seattle Beacon Food Forest, that one, I love the design of it. But some of them just haven't been built out yet. So you visit that site and it doesn't, you know, there's not as much there, I guess, is what you're kind of anticipating being there. And what's interesting is that there are spaces that we don't even realize that are kind of edible spaces. And so it can be really interesting just to, you know, look on our own campus and things like that and see the June berries that are planted around there, Ronia berries, and various different nut trees and persimmons and things along that line. And so in a way, it's almost more interesting to discover those kind of unexpected edible items in the landscape.
Yeah, I've experienced that. A lot of times we do consultations with folks and they ask us for an edible landscape, and we point out 10 different plants they can eat from their yard they didn't even know were edible.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So do I get to ask you questions too?
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was awesome to see your projects. I mean, it's so nice to see the people that are actually doing the work designing these amazing spaces and to, connect with that, because that's where you're really serving as that interface between the client and getting to this desirable space and trying to pull all those pieces together. What I'm curious about from our perspective is just what kind of challenges are you seeing that you think that we could address with research? So there are obviously challenges out there, but there might be some that are more relevant to the things that we do, like at the Center for Agroforestry.
Wow, that's a great question. You know, um, So I think that one of the big things that's coming to mind for me is like in some of those pictures I showed about like forageable plants like sedum and Solomon seal and hostas and things like that. I think that there's a lot of like anecdotal information about like what is safe to eat, how much can you eat. You might read somebody's blog and it says things like, don't eat too much of that, dock, you're poison yourself. And then another person's like, eat all the dock you want. So I think having a better understanding of some of those, the edible nature around like safety and of those like of the plants that we can forage from would be something that comes to mind.
Yeah, that's a good area. So most of our group works on the tree crops, shrubs and trees, but there was actually a paper that just came out from somebody from our group that was looking at the cyanide issue in elderberry. So, we hear a lot about the toxicity of elderberry and all this concern about it, but their research basically showed that the level of cyanide in elderberry is less than what you would get in just traditional apple juice, and way, way, way less than what's in an apple seed, which we often eat accident. If you're eating an apple, you often just eat the apple seed or whatever accidentally. So there's really high levels in there too. So yeah, those are good questions for sure.
The other one I'll throw at you, which you don't read about this pest when you're often reading about agriculture, but the biggest pest we have in terms of fruit tree and nut production is the squirrel. And and there's very little outside of just like backyard gardening blogs about how do we truly, not give huge harvests to the squirrels and have some for ourselves sometimes.
Yeah, other than just like putting a cage over the entire thing. Yeah, it's such a uniquely kind of urban problem. Like I had a big food forest in Illinois that was surrounded by crop fields, and there were we had none, no squirrel damage at all. Rabbit damage, yes, but no squirrel damage. So it is such a connection to like an urban forestry type of setting, but I don't have a good answer though. But I have almost cried large tears looking out a window at this Juneberry that was just getting ripe. I was just waiting for some of that ripeness and just watching that squirrel just like take it all. It was painful.
Nice.
Painful.
There is a couple of questions that have come in about management in a way that is either organic or low maintenance, so that you can have productive crops with all of the different pests, and thinking about the human education component too, of understanding what has to go in and how things might look. So if you have any input on that. The specific question was, how do we help fruit growers avoid heavy use of synthetic chemicals, and any homeopathic treatments for fire blight outside of just cutting infected branches?
Was that one for me, Hannah, or for Matt?
For either of you.
I guess my sense would be to make those plant selections early on in trying to just really avoid species that are likely to need that type of those types of treatments. You know, we have so many great native plants that typically require a little in terms of pesticides. So that would be my first bet. And even when we do use non-native plants, selecting the varieties, as Matt said, that are insect and disease resistant as much as possible. But there's certainly an education aspect to it too, and that's been, I guess, one of the pushbacks we get from like urban planners and park systems and things like that, is that they worry about putting edibles in there and that people will consume those, and maybe they haven't taken the care to understand what's been applied to them.
Anything to add, Matt?
No, not really. You know, I think it's all about selection and diversity, and you know, things that we probably already are thinking about. One of the big things for us is that we plant we really focus on berries as much as possible, at least if we're talking about the urban and suburban environment, where we may not be talking about commercial production, because berries just tend to be easier to manage, easier to grow, earlier to produce. So we're planting a lot of things like, you know, service berries and mulberries and currants in the early spring, and then a lot of diversity of blackberries and raspberries throughout the summer and into the fall. And that serves as a really great foundation. And none of those things need sprays in our environment. And you can, you know, fairly easily grow those things. So yep, I see a comment about the fire blight thing, and I wouldn't have a homeopathic treatment. I think that referring to Michael Phillips' work is where it's at with homeopathic fruit tree treatment on the fire blight issue.
Yeah, so, you know, thinking about the human aspect of these things, I think another important question that someone posted here is, where would be a good place to start in researching the legal structures of social enterprises operating community or urban food forests, not-for-profit models, limited liability companies, cooperatives, etc.? How is taxation of these social enterprises handled? Issuing too many K1s, avoided if partnership taxation is elected? Thoughts on that, either of you? I will say this book, I think, could be a good one for, oh, this is a little blurry. This is the Community Food Forest Handbook by Catherine Bukowski and John Munsell. And Kathy Bukowski, her website, communityfoodforest.com, I believe, is a great place to see some examples, like the Beacon Food Forest that Sarah mentioned too.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience with that, so I'm probably better to pass on that question.
You know, we are structured just as a for-profit company, and that, you know, we don't have a lot of different hoops to jump through that other just regular companies don't have to. And that it is a lot, you know, that's chosen by design, because I wanted us to, being a social enterprise, I think just for us means doing the right thing, you know, taking care of the earth, taking care of the people who are on staff, and supporting our community with all the means that we can financially burden. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but that, you know, there's nothing special about us. We're just trying to do the right thing and figure out how our values can align with a profit model that pays people.
There are a lot of models, and this is a really great question. And, you know, custom food scaping is one great example, but there are many, and I think the case studies that Kathy Bukowski has posted about is a nice way to see just all of the different ways that people have gone about this. Another question that I have had also, actually, that came in early in regard to Sarah's presentation about the recognized agroforestry practices is, why does this sixth practice have to be urban food forests versus just food forests? Or I would even expand that to, why food forests instead of forests for other kinds of harvest, forest gardens?
That's a good question, and I didn't make that decision. But for me, yeah, there's not I don't see a big difference between a food forest versus forest gardening. They're kind of, most of them are kind of the same, similar types of structure and similar types of approaches. I'm not sure why the decision was made to have urban in there, other than that maybe just trying to come up with something that was very specific to the urban setting might differentiate it a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, and I sort of imagine it as more community food forests, and thinking about just in a different context.
Yeah, I think community probably is a good word to capture what I think the thinking was with that.
Mm-hmm. This question is specifically for Matt, asking, this person is looking for an ecological design master's program with a focus on foodscaping and coming up with very little. Wondering where you did your ecological design studies.
Well, my ecological design studies are mostly self-taught and book taught and experimentation taught. It's not a formal thing. I did the whole permaculture design course, every one that I could find, and different like specific trainings, usually around permaculture design, or a few years ago went down and studied with Brad Lancaster and the folks in Arizona and all their water harvesting stuff for a little training, which is only to say that my education is just kind of a whole mess of those trainings around this topic, not a formal university path.
There's so much to learn from plants, isn't there? And I'll also mention, in response to that question, that the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri has an entirely online graduate certification and master's program in agroforestry, and you can have any kind of focus within that study too. So you can learn more about that from centerforagroforestry.org. And as we are getting so close to the end here, there are more questions. So if either of you would like to scroll through and answer any of them for specific people, feel free to do that. But while we're here together, someone did also ask if you'd be willing to share your contact information in the chat, that would be much appreciated too. So feel free to do that. And some of those follow-up questions might happen in that way then also. There are a couple plant-specific questions that we can maybe just touch on briefly. One is about pawpaws, how they hold up to drought and cold, and what kinds of soil do they like? That either of you are welcome to respond to.
I'm no pawpaw expert, but they certainly seem to be fine in, in somewhat wet feet and not standing water per se, but we often plant them on sites that have plenty of water. That's how we often see them, in the woods and stuff like that. But they seem to be, but you can find them everywhere on hills, steep hillsides and stuff. So they seem to be just pretty adaptable in my experience, but
yeah, I think they probably benefit from irrigation in sites that are a little bit drier. And yeah, like you said, sometimes where we see them in the wild is sometimes where they are in even flood zones a little bit. So they have some adaptation to those types of conditions, which is nice because like in Missouri, some areas that are flooded could be prime areas for things like pawpaws and pecans.
Yeah, their native range is really far south, but I know people who are growing pawpaws in northern Wisconsin, so they seem to be pretty adaptable. And there is a great conversation happening about currants that don't harbor the pine rust infection. So if you have any other thoughts on that, would be great. It looks like there are some posts that there are cultivars that don't do that.
Yeah, I think many cultivars now are not susceptible to that. So it's much less of a problem than it used to be, but it's still good to be careful. And I know like some cultivars aren't even allowed to be shipped to certain areas, which is a good indicator of, what ones to look out for.
Okay, well, with that, it is 7 o'clock. So we have filled this entire hour, and in respect for everyone's time, we can take off and keep on keeping on with our perennial plantings. Thank you so much, Sarah and Matt. And for those who maybe missed part of this or who weren't able to join us, this recording will be posted on the YouTube channels for Mizzou Agroforestry and for Savannah Institute, so you can look for them there. Thank you very much.